So Tom is a landscape architect, teacher, and writer who'll be well known to many of you as, I think quite a lot of you were his students. Tom.
My screen's blank. There we are.
The screen's blank.
No, it's come now, it's come. Thank you to Tim for inviting me to speak. And thank you to the previous speakers for explaining more thoroughly than I'm going to do the projects I'm going to be talking about. Thank you also to Tim for giving me a challenging subject. It was the philosophical and theoretical approach which underpins Hal's work. Hal, if I get it completely wrong, I rely on you completely to say so. I have interpreted this question, this subject, with a question, which is, where in the history of art does the landscape architecture of Hal Moggridge sit? And what I'm going to talk about is style first, and then art, and then Hal. Hal may not remember, but 50 years ago, he went, I believe, to an IFLA conference, might have been in Brussels, and afterwards he led a post-conference tour in England, correct? Yes, well, after that, Hal's forgotten this incident, but I have not. After that, he suggested, he thought that it would be a good thing for visitors to England to have a visitor's guide, and he suggested that I might like to write it. And I said yes, and I made a proposal to a publisher, Charles Letts, and they did a mock-up and looked at it and said, no. But in the mock-up, there was also a short history of landscape design and these scribbly diagrams. At about that time, I was working not for Sylvia Crowe, but in her office, and she came in one day and saw the diagrams, and she picked it up and looked at them, and she read through, and she said, Tom, they're wonderful. Now, as you probably know, a compliment can have as much impact on a young man as it can on a young lady. And one way or another, Hal, I've been working this out ever since. So 10 years later, the 6 diagrams that I'd done for the mock-up had grown to 9+1 diagrams, and the 9th diagram, it simply said, watch this space. And I was still reading and thinking about the subject, and I was asked to review a book about Geoffrey Jellicoe's complete works by Michael Spence. And when I read the book and thought about it, what struck me was that his work was not postmodern. The illustration there, that was chosen by Building Design. It's obviously the bridge, the crystal span bridge that Hal designed. And what I wrote in the review was that I think it would be very fair to describe Jellicoe as one of the first postmodernists. And I did that with trepidation, because to call somebody a postmodernist wasn't much of a compliment at that time. But I needn't have worried. 2 days later, a letter arrived with a card inside, and on the card it said, Dear Tom, thanks for a great write-up, Geoffrey. And so since that time, I've been confident in describing Geoffrey as postmodern. And the reason I did it, I don't know if he would have supported this or not, but the reason I did it was largely on the basis of this wonderful design he did for the restaurant in the Cheddar Gorge. It was illustrated in the 30s in books on modern architecture and abstract design. But Geoffrey's design, and this is the key point to me, it wasn't abstract. The pool in front of the Cheddar Gorge restaurant had a glass floor. And Geoffrey's idea was that you looked up and you saw the fish and the green slime swimming about. And that related his work to a grand narrative, a very grand narrative, that of man's evolution from the miasmal mire, which you see looking up. So it was a design with a story. It wasn't abstract. And so I called it postmodern. And then I thought, well, I've got Geoffrey classified as being influenced by both modernism and postmodernism. Isn't that a good framework for thinking about Hal's work? And that's what I've done. So the first question, which has been very fully answered today, is does Hal see landscape architecture as one of the fine arts? And I believe the answer is yes. Did you?
Absolutely.
Oh. To Hal. I interviewed Hal 5 years ago. I just put it on YouTube, the record of the interview last week. I made a terrible mistake with the soundtrack, and AI processing has put that right, and it's still pretty awful, but you can hear it now, and so I published it last week. And in it, Hal says that one of the projects he did with Geoffrey was the Welwyn Hatfield Hospital. It was a wonderful scheme and had a Mondrian-esque front courtyard. And if you look at the design for the bridge, which was Geoffrey's project, but Hal, I think, worked on it pretty well independently of Geoffrey on the design of the bridge.
Well, I was working in the office, but I designed it completely.
You designed it, yeah. I mean, I put a bit of Mondrian there. I see an influence of Mondrian and abstract art in this design. And then I wondered whether there's any strand of modernism in the work of Colvin and Moggridge. And I think my answer to that is probably not. So then, is there any postmodernism apparent in the work of Hal and of Colvin and Moggridge? And my answer to that is definitely not, that I know of. In Charles Jenks's sense of the term postmodern, which is limited and inadequate in my view. The man who coined the word postmodernism, and the first man to use it, obviously in a book, was an Anglican priest working in America who was Canon Iddings Bell. And what he was interested in was theology and not in art. And what he argued was that religious fundamentalism doesn't work anymore in the age of science and evolution. And modernism, he thought, not modern anymore. 1926, he thought that, and yet we're still talking about modern art and modern architecture, which I think is a big mistake. But what he said was, because of those, the past being behind us, and what's called modernism being behind us, that what we ought to be talking about now is postmodernism. And that's the sense in which I think it applies to Geoffrey, and also, I'm going to suggest, to Hal. So this project, so I want to give some examples of Hal's work, and just to see how it might relate. This terrific project for Uffington White Horse, what Hal has looked at there is the same immense, well, not quite as long as Geoffrey, but a very long period of time in that he's from the Iron Age, when the Uffington horse was carved, until the present and into the future. And his own work is, to borrow a term from conceptual art, an intervention in a very long time series. And so got rid of this awful car park and put a brilliant one, which has been illustrated this morning. One thing that wasn't brought out is that it's completely hidden. And Hal persuaded the client to enlarge the site so that the whole thing becomes a sacred landscape, in effect. And Hal's is an intervention in that. And so the cars are all hidden, as cars always should be. And then there were outlets for the people to come out of the car park and to appreciate the sacred landscape. So what comes next? My original 6 diagrams, they grew to 9, and now they've grown to 28 plus 1 diagrams. And give me long enough, and I'll get to 100. But in 2013, I published this set of diagrams, and also on the right here, another diagram. And what I called it was a sustainable style. It was looking ahead. But in preparing for this lecture, I looked up to see how I'd done the diagram. I mean, the original ones were felt tip pen and a scrubby pencil, and then the second lot were repeatograph, and these were CAD. But this is designed with nature. It's a rock. And to show the building, akin to the other diagrams, it's got a collection of chips of grey wacky. Well, preparing for this lecture, I looked up the lichen. A friend, Amanda Davey, her husband was a specialist in, she's a landscape architect, a specialist in lichens, and he identified it for me as Rhizocarpum geographicum, known in English as the map lichen. So can you imagine my pleasure in this? I then looked up to read about this lichen, and what it said is that the leading characteristic of it is slow growth. The lichen grows at 1 millimeter a year. And I'm happy to report that Hal works a whole lot quicker than that. but if I were to redo the book, I'd be very tempted to call, because all the other diagrams, the styles relate to the history of art. And so this one, I think, should also. And I could call it slow growth, or maybe the evolutionary style. We'll have to wait and see. So then I began to wonder is where might this influence of Hal have come from? And the easy and obvious answer is Brenda Colvin. And her book, the title was Land and Landscape, Evolution, Design and Control. So she's got that sense, consciousness of intervening in a process rather than doing a one-off thing. As I say, the conceptual artists call it an intervention. And Hal can put me right on that in due course. But then I began thinking about art. And of course, the parent of abstract and modern art is Cubism. Braque, Picasso, etc. And its first 2 children, the first 2 isms, were Constructivism and Neoplasticism, or Stijl, more commonly called. Since then, it's had thousands and thousands of isms that we can't possibly keep touch with. Well, the dominant strand of influence of landscape architecture, of modern art on landscape architecture has come to the right of this diagram with Mondrian and with Hal as a young man and with modern architecture. But there's another strand which some landscape architects, notably Diana, of course, have been especially interested in, which is constructivism. And personally, I think that the landscape architecture profession, I think it went down the wrong branch. I think it came to the right, and it would do much better, and would still do much better, to go to the left. Well, the most wonderful example of constructivism in London, perhaps in Europe, is the Naum Gabo sculpture, Revolving Torsion, which is in the courtyard of St. Thomas's Hospital. And it's especially close to my own heart, this project, because my granny was born on this spot. Her father had a tied house because he was working for St. Thomas's Hospital, and it was bombed in the war, and that's how this came about. But you can see constructivism is lots of different things. It's got a socialist stream, a utilitarian, a political, but just in terms of graphic design or art, the two things that I think we can associate with Hal, with landscape architecture, are the dynamism and the concern with space. And so the Gabo fountain, the object is actually for him comparatively insignificant. It's the water, and it revolves. I tried to put a video here, and I couldn't get it to work in the PowerPoint, but I have got a lovely video of this, which I'll see if Annabelle lets me, if I can slot it into the YouTube version of this. But it's dynamic, and it's about space. So this project you've heard about before, and one could have just seen it as a courtyard project, but it's not. It's an intervention in a very long process, going back to Henry VIII, of course, who greatest open space planner London's ever had. People remember him far too much for his wives and not enough for his landscape architecture. But the Horse Guards parade is it's a focal point for the design structure of London. It's the point where the Royal Parks chain to the west meets Whitehall Palace, which was where the Tudor kings lived. And it was this unspeakable, static car park. And Hal's made it into a dynamic space. I mean, part of that is simply the surfacing material. The gravel compared to bitumen is brilliant. You know, it crunches when you walk on it, and it changes. When it rains, it changes color. It's a dynamic element, like the torsion sculpture. And then you've got the people there as well. And if I succeeded in getting my video working, you could actually have watched the cyclists cycling here. And Hal contrasts, well, he contrasts landscape with architecture and says about the Bauhaus, which is, of course, the prime example of this style, the originator of modernist architecture. He criticizes it for being wonderful, but set in a barren landscape. And it's absolutely true. But it's not just barren. It's not dynamic. It's static. It's got no movement in it. It's dreary and it's dull. In fact, even the Bauhaus. Have I got time, Tim, for a short anecdote? If I finish at 1:15. Well, when I went to the Bauhaus principles, they're more fiction than fact. They're dreamland, really. And it's supposed to be a prime example of form follows function. Well, I was there with a video camera, and I had to sit on the floor to change my battery. And I had with me a spirit level, because I wanted to get the videos horizontal. I'm sure Mike uses one as well. Well, so I took off my level and I put it down on the floor, and the bubble in the level went like that. That was a completely irrelevant anecdote. So, next project. When working on Blenheim Park, Hal hasn't looked at it as a moment in history. He's looked at it as an incident in history, which is very different. And so the consideration began in 1772. Hal's plan was done in 1981, and his commission was to look 14 years ahead. But being a naughty boy sometimes, he looked 200 years ahead. And when he explained this to the Duke of Marlborough, he was, in Hal's word, tickled. the thought that his family were going to be here, I suppose, for at least another 200 years. The next project is Naum. And it's another old park, and the most interesting aspect of it, and Hal was appointed after the Great Storm, was it 1987, I think, a major tree planting project. And trees don't like, when they're young, don't like being eaten by deer. And to put a 2-meter deer fence around it would have been awful. But it worked out that when deer are in an enclosure, they need to have a good run to jump over the fence. And so if you make it less than 18 meters across, they won't go into the enclosure to eat the plants, let alone being able to get out of it. So again, it's an intervention in a very long process. Now, so that's the dynamic aspect of constructivism that I mentioned. And I want to turn to the spatial aspect of constructivism, which is, well, I think it's crucial, actually, to landscape architecture, is my own view. That's why I'm a particular admirer of these projects I'm going to show you. I think it's crucial because, really, landscape design is about space. It's not about details and objects and trees and plants. It's certainly not soft landscape. And that's my worry, actually, about when people talk about landscape-led. I think what they mean is soft stuff led, which is all wrong. It's about the design of space. In 2005, Hal circulated a pamphlet. I haven't seen it. If you've got one, Hal, I'd love to see it if you have. Your pamphlet on poetic views.
Yes, I still have.
Oh, I'd love to see that. I'd love to see that. This is another project. Hal picked out particularly poetic views in London. Was One Tree Hill one of them? So the view of Greenwich Park.
I can't remember.
No. We'll both find out. This is a fairly recent project. It's a view from One Tree Hill, which JMW Turner painted. That's in the foreground, and they've just put up a placard to show it, which is great. But they've just removed some trees in the same way that the trees were removed from blocking the design structure of London. They were removed from here. And if you think of our art as being dynamic, it's wonderful that it's taking things away as well as putting things in order to make an ideal landscape. Now, going further with the spatial aspect, which Martin mentioned this morning. I've got some images at the bottom here. I'm picking out different approaches to constructivism. I guess it's Kandinsky and Popovo and Malevich. And look particularly, oh gosh, I should use this thing for this. Look particularly at Popovo's work and Kandinsky. Kandinsky's great inspiration for landscape architects. And is there not a kinship in Hal's spatial diagrams for London. There's a visual kinship, but it's more than that. It's the focus on space rather than on objects. And you may well say, you can't say that's not cricket, because what Hal's got for us here is a diagram of multi-dimensional cricket. And so you can see that for Edinburgh and London and the views around St James's Park, it's constructivist spatial conception and design, and brilliant as such. But those diagrams are good, but this one, which Martin also showed us, is even better. It's a fabulous work. You can't see it, Hal, but it's your contour plan for the heights of buildings in London. And particularly, well, no, mainly focusing on the royal parks here. But as Hal says, he was slightly overcautious, because what's needed is a contour plan for the whole of London and for all the other cities in the world. They'd be far better places if they were based on, well, you talk about landscape there, how's that? That when you do a city plan, instead of doing the roads and stuff like that, you do a contour plan for the whole city. Well, after, I think 2012, about that, Hal and I and Robert, we gave a talk, and Ing was there, we gave a talk about skyline planning in cities to the London branch of the Landscape Institute. And at the end of the talk, we were asked to write a paper about it. Well, I mean, perhaps that's not quite the right way to put it. What I think we should say is we suggested writing the paper, and they said, oh yes, that would be a good thing to do. And so we wrote a skyline policy paper and sent it to the landscape. We sent it to the London branch first, and they said they had no authority to publish it, and so they sent it to central office. And they wrote back to say, yes, but could you do a paper that looks at skyline planning around the world instead of just in London? And so, yes, and we wrote that off, sent that off, and that was 10 years ago. And I've sent a few reminders over the years to say, don't you think it's about time that we published it? And I'm still hoping that they're going to publish it as a 90th birthday present to Hal. But what I think is, the reason they didn't publish it is that they wanted an expert to say that it was kosher, that it was all right to publish this document, because there weren't anything to compare it with. And of course, they couldn't find an expert to give that opinion, because the greatest expert on skyline planning in the UK, or perhaps in Europe, is Hal Moggridge. So, thank you, Hal.
Tom, don't go away.
Don't go away.
So, I wonder whether, Hal, you'd like to respond to any of these points before we go to lunch.
Well, a comment occurred to me when talking and thinking about art and landscape architecture. Landscape architecture also, of course, has a practical human side. It has to work as places that people are in and move about in, particularly move about in. I think moving through landscape is, in a way, the essence of what it is. And so it's not only art, it's art for people to live in, to be in.
But was a key theme of the early constructivists. I mean, if you look up a reference to it, it always says that one of the main things about constructivism is its utilitarian aspect. Right. And so I haven't got out of being classified as constructivism yet, Hal, but good try. And if you'd like to have another go,
I'll accept that.
Excellent. I have a feeling that argument might go beyond our deadline, so it will have to be taken up elsewhere. But thank you so much, Tom. And I think perhaps the critical thing that came out of that is the focus on space, which Hal has shown us. Although I can't not repeat the extraordinary idea that Henry VIII should be remembered more for his landscape architecture than his wives. So with that, it's time for lunch.